In 1775, America was nothing but an idea. 13 scattered colonies, no government, no treasury, no flag, and no navy. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire ruled the seas with over 500 warships, each one a floating fortress of oak, iron, and discipline. To rebel against Britain was madness. To fight their navy was suicide. But in the chaos of revolution, one question would ignite a legacy that would outlive empires. What if we build our own fleet and meet the empire at sea? That question, born in a small chamber in Philadelphia, would give birth to one of the most powerful forces the world has ever known. The United States Navy, October 13th, 1775. Inside the Continental Congress, men debated the unthinkable. America's army was starving. British blockades strangled every port. Without control of the seas, independence was a dream destined to drown. So the delegates voted to purchase and arm 2 small vessels, 2 ships, to hunt an empire. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just ink on paper and faith that freedom could float. That moment, quiet, almost invisible, marked the birth of the United States Navy. In shipyards along the coast, carpenters and blacksmiths labored by torchlight. They weren't building ships of commerce anymore. They were building weapons of rebellion. The first American warships were not grand frigates. They were merchant schooners refitted with cannons scavenged from forts. Their crews were farmers, fishermen, and runaway apprentices who barely knew port from starboard. But they had something the empire didn't: desperation and purpose. One of the earliest captains, Isaac Hopkins, led a small squadron south to raid British ships near the Bahamas. They returned with gunpowder and supplies, a victory small in number but huge in spirit. At night, the men stood on deck, staring into the endless sea. "We're sailing against the mightiest fleet on earth," one whispered. "Aye," another answered quietly, "but we fight for a world that doesn't exist yet." For the first time, the stars and stripes, still crude and handmade, flew above the Atlantic. It wasn't dominance, but it was defiance. The British Navy struck back with overwhelming force. American ports were blockaded. Ships were burned before they ever reached the sea. The infant Navy bled men, timber, and hope. But from failure came learning. Every lost ship taught lessons: navigation, discipline, courage under fire. And through chaos, a warrior spirit began to form, one that refused surrender. The Continental Navy captured or destroyed nearly 200 British vessels before the war's end. That number was small beside Britain's might, but enormous for a nation that had begun with nothing. When the Treaty of Paris ended the war in 1783, the young republic had survived, and so had the idea that America must never again be defenseless at sea. Among those early heroes stood one name above all: John Paul Jones, a Scotsman by birth, an American by destiny. In 1779, commanding the Bonhomme Richard, Jones faced the British warship HMS Serapis off the coast of England. His ship was shattered, his decks aflame, and the sea around him glowed red with fire and blood. The British captain shouted across the water, "Do you strike your colors?" Jones's reply would echo through centuries, "I have not yet begun to fight." Hours later, it was the British who struck their colors. That battle proved that courage could overcome numbers, that the will to fight, not the size of the ship, defines a navy's soul. After the Revolution, peace brought neglect. The Continental Navy was sold off, its ships left to rot. By 1785, America once again had no navy. But peace is a temporary illusion. Across the Atlantic, Barbary pirates began seizing American merchant ships in the Mediterranean. The young nation was humiliated, forced to pay ransom to criminals. President George Washington had seen enough. In 1794, Congress authorized the construction of 6 new frigates, the foundation of a permanent navy. Among them stood the USS Constitution. Her hull was oak so dense that British cannonballs bounced off, earning her the name Old Ironsides. She became a symbol of American endurance. And she still floats today, more than 2 centuries later. The 19th century forged the Navy in wars that shaped the Republic. In 1812, American ships like the Constitution and the United States battled Britain once again and won respect on the world stage. Then came the Civil War, when technology transformed everything. Ironclads replaced wooden decks. Steam replaced wind. Brother fought brother on sea as well as land. At Hampton Roads, 2 iron beasts met in combat, the Monitor and the Merrimac. Their clash thundered across the coast, marking the death of wooden warships and the birth of a new age. By the dawn of the 20th century, America's fleet stretched far beyond its own shores. In 1898, victory over Spain at Manila Bay and Santiago announced America's arrival as a global power. The U.S. flag now flew across the Pacific, from Hawaii to the Philippines. The Navy was no longer just a defense, it was a declaration. When the world plunged into war again in 1941, the Navy faced its darkest hour. Pearl Harbor, Sunday morning, December 7th. Battleships burned in the harbor. Thousands died, but the enemy had awakened a sleeping giant. In 4 years, America launched more ships than the world had ever seen. Carriers, destroyers, submarines, an industrial storm that turned the tide of war. At Midway, carrier pilots shattered the Japanese fleet. At Normandy, naval guns thundered in support of liberation. At Iwo Jima, sailors and Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, a symbol born of blood and water. The ocean became a battlefield, and the United States Navy became its master. After 1945, the world's oceans became the new front line. Nuclear submarines roamed unseen, carrying weapons that could end civilization. Carrier groups circled the globe, projecting American power to every horizon. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, the United States Navy became not just a shield, but the tip of the spear. Technology advanced, but the creed remained the same: honor, courage, commitment. 2 ships in 1775, that's all it began with. 2 fragile vessels built on faith and defiance. Today, the United States Navy commands oceans, guards space, and sails in silence beneath the waves. From wooden decks to nuclear steel, from rebellion to superpower, its journey mirrors the rise of America itself. The ocean does not forgive weakness, an admiral once said. It respects only those who endure, and through storms, wars, and centuries, the United States Navy endures.